London, 1765. A quiet office in Leadenhall Street. No armies marching, no cannons firing, just a clerk dipping his quill into ink and signing a document called the Diwani. We are told that India fell to the British sword. We are told it was about military genius and colonial ambition. That is a lie. India did not fall to the British army. India was bankrupted by the British accountant. The weapon was not the musket. It was the ledger. The theft was not measured in diamonds or rubies. It was measured in the slow, invisible draining of silver and gold through a manipulation so elegant that most people never saw it happening. $45 trillion. That is the number economists have calculated. 45 trillion drained from India between 1765 and 1938. Not stolen in one dramatic heist, but siphoned year by year, rupee by rupee, through exchange rates and tax policy. This is the story of how a currency scam destroyed a civilization. In the early 1700s, India was not poor. India was not backward. India was the workshop of the world. It produced 1/4 of all global manufacturing output. The textiles woven in Bengal were so fine that European queens paid fortunes for a single sari. The steel forged in the south was sharper and stronger than anything Europe could make. The ships built in Gujarat sailed faster and lasted longer than the vessels of the Royal Navy. India had wealth. India had technology. India had trade routes stretching from the Mediterranean to the Java Sea. For centuries, Europe wanted what India had. But India wanted nothing Europe could offer. British wool was too coarse. British manufacturing was primitive compared to Indian craftsmanship. So the trade was one way. European merchants sailed to Indian ports with holds full of silver and gold. They paid in hard bullion. They sailed back with silk and spices. Europe was bleeding precious metal. India was called the sink of the world's bullion. The Romans complained about it. The Spanish complained about it. The British complained about it. The wealth flowed east, and it never came back. But in 1757, something changed. The East India Company, a private corporation, defeated the Nawab of Bengal at the Battle of Plassey. Suddenly, a corporation owned the richest province in Asia. In 1765, they received the Diwani, the legal right to collect taxes from Bengal. This was the moment. This was when the river reversed. Before 1765, the company had to bring silver from London to buy Indian goods. After 1765, they stopped bringing silver. They used the tax money collected from Indian peasants to buy the goods those same peasants produced. Think about the mechanics of that. The Indian farmer paid tax to the company. The company used that tax money to buy the farmer's cloth. Then the company shipped the cloth to London and sold it for profit. The Indians were paying the British to rob them. It was a scam so perfect it became policy. But simple taxation was not enough. The British realized they needed to control something deeper. They needed to control the currency itself. And this brings us to the war between silver and gold. For most of human history, both metals served as money. India used silver. The rupee was a coin containing a specific weight of pure silver. Britain used gold. The pound was backed by gold reserves. For centuries, the exchange rate was stable. 15 ounces of silver equaled 1 ounce of gold. This ratio held. It was predictable. But in the 1870s, disaster struck the silver markets. Massive new mines opened in Nevada and Latin America. Silver flooded the global supply. At the same time, the newly unified German Empire switched to the gold standard. Germany dumped its silver reserves onto the world market. The price of silver collapsed. For a country holding its wealth in silver, this was a catastrophe. The value of the rupee began to free fall against the British pound. In 1870, 1 rupee was worth about 2 shillings. By 1890, it had dropped to just over 1 shilling. The money in the pockets of Indian people lost half its purchasing power on the international stage. If India had been independent, it could have protected itself. It could have imposed tariffs or switched to gold. But India was not independent. India was a colony. And the bankers in London saw the silver crisis not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. They realized they could use the gap between the falling silver rupee and the stable gold pound to engineer a mechanism of permanent extraction. The mechanism was called the Home Charges. This was a bill that India had to pay to Britain every year. Ostensibly, it was payment for the cost of being governed. India had to pay for the British soldiers stationed on Indian soil. India had to pay pensions for British officials who retired to London. India had to pay for railway equipment sold to them at inflated prices by British manufacturers. And India had to pay interest on debt that Britain itself had imposed on India. Here was the trap. Taxes in India were collected in silver rupees from peasants, but the home charges had to be paid in gold pounds to London. As silver crashed, the Indian government had to collect more and more rupees to pay the same debt in pounds. It was a treadmill that never stopped. If the rupee lost half its value, the peasant had to surrender twice as much grain, twice as much cotton, twice as much labor, just to stay still. The British could have fixed this. Indian merchants begged them to allow India to adopt the gold standard. They wanted a gold rupee to compete with the British sovereign. London refused. They deliberately kept India on a collapsing silver standard while the rest of the world moved to gold. Why? Because a cheap rupee was profitable for British trade. A weak rupee meant Indian exports were cheap for British buyers. Britain could buy wheat and cotton and jute at rock-bottom prices. But it also meant India could not afford to import machinery or technology from abroad. India was trapped as a supplier of raw materials. It was deindustrialized by monetary policy. But the scam went deeper. It involved the physical removal of gold from India. The British set up a system called council bills. This is where the theft became surgical. Imagine you are a British merchant in London. You want to buy tea from India. You have gold pounds. Normally, you would ship that gold to India to pay the Indian tea farmer. If you did that, India's gold reserves would grow. But the British government did not want gold flowing into India, so they intercepted it. They told the merchant, "Do not send the gold. Give it to us in London. We will give you a piece of paper called a council bill. Mail that paper to India. The Indian tea farmer takes it to the colonial government in Kolkata. They give him rupees printed locally. So what happened to the gold? The gold stayed in London. It was deposited in the Bank of England. It backed the British pound. It funded British businesses. It paid for the British military. The gold that was supposed to pay for Indian goods never reached India. India got paper rupees, which caused inflation internally. London got the hard asset. This system meant India was exporting its goods for free. The gold that should have entered India as payment was hijacked. Economists call this the absorption of India's balance of trade surplus. India was selling far more than it was buying. By every law of economics, India should have been accumulating gold. India should have become the world's banker. But because of council bills, the gold was siphoned to London. The impact on the Indian peasant was devastating. To pay taxes in a currency that was constantly losing value, peasants were forced to stop growing food. They started growing cash crops for export. They stopped planting rice and wheat for their families. They started planting cotton, opium, and indigo for the empire. They had to export to survive. They had to sell their grain to the global market to earn the silver to pay the tax. This led to the nightmare of food leaving India during famines. In the late 1800s, a series of terrible famines swept across India. Millions died of starvation. In the Madras famine of 1877, roughly 5 million people perished. And yet, in that same year, India exported a record amount of wheat to Britain. The telegraph lines and railways, which the British claimed were gifts, were actually used to suck grain out of the interior and ship it to London. The railways were not infrastructure. They were extraction machinery. Viceroy Lytton, who was in charge during the famine, refused to intervene. He believed in the free market. He argued that if wheat fetched a higher price in London than in Madras, then the wheat should go to London. He insisted the silver tax be collected with absolute rigidity. If a peasant could not pay, his land was confiscated. To save their land, peasants sold their family jewelry. They sold their wives' silver bangles. They sold the small amounts of gold saved for generations. This was the distress gold. During the famines, tons of gold flowed out of Indian villages and into the vaults of the Bank of England. The suffering of the Indian peasant was the liquidity that kept the British Empire solvent. When the London stock market crashed, when the Bank of England needed reserves, they tightened screws on India. They contracted the money supply, forcing interest rates up and forcing more gold out. The British Empire was a pyramid scheme. India was the base. The stability of the British pound, the currency that ruled the world, was dependent on the surplus stolen from India. Britain ran a trade deficit with the rest of the world. They bought more from America and Europe than they sold. They should have gone broke, but they balanced their books by taking India's surplus. They used India's earnings to pay for their own consumption. It was a system perfectly engineered for extraction, a currency manipulation that devalued the labor of millions, a tax system that forced the export of food while people starved, and the gold of the East stacked in the vaults of the West. By the turn of the 20th century, the drain had become a well-oiled machine. Council bills and the manipulation of the silver rupee gave London a blank check drawn on Indian resources. But the geopolitical world was changing. The First World War was coming, and the demands on the British Treasury were about to explode. The theft was about to shift from a steady stream to a flood. When World War I broke out in 1914, Britain needed two things desperately: soldiers and money. India provided both. Over 1 million Indian soldiers served in the trenches of Europe and the deserts of the Middle East. But the financial contribution was even more staggering. The British government simply charged India for the cost of the war. They called it a gift. The Indian taxpayer paid for the recruitment, equipment, and transport of troops fighting to defend the British Empire. This gift amounted to hundreds of millions of pounds. It was a gift given by a population with no vote and no say. But the real financial crime of the 20th century occurred during and after the Second World War. This chapter is rarely taught in British schools, but it remains a burning scar in the economic memory of India. It involves a concept called the sterling balances. When World War II began in 1939, Britain was terrified. They knew they could not afford to fight Germany alone. They needed the resources of the entire empire. They turned India into a massive supply base. Indian factories churned out uniforms, ammunition, and steel. Indian farmers grew food to feed Allied armies. Britain needed these goods, but they had no money to pay for them. The British economy was shattered. They had no gold left, so they came up with a new system. They simply promised to pay later. Every time the British government bought goods from India, they credited the payment to a bank account in London. These were the sterling balances. It was an IOU. India was lending Britain the money to fight the war. The Indian Reserve Bank printed rupees to pay local suppliers, causing massive inflation. Meanwhile, the British deposited paper promises in a vault. By the end of the war in 1945, the debt was colossal. Britain owed India £1.25 billion. In today's money, that is hundreds of billions of dollars. It was a reversal of history. After 2 centuries of looting, Britain had become the debtor. India was the creditor. India had financed the British war effort to the point where Britain was deeply in debt to its own colony. Logic would dictate that when the war ended and India gained independence, Britain would pay back the money. This capital could have kick-started the Indian economy. It could have built dams, power plants, universities. It was the accumulated savings of a nation starved and overworked for the war effort. During the Bengal famine of 1943, 3 million people died. Winston Churchill continued to divert shipping and food away from India to reserve stockpiles for Europe. The food that could have saved those 3 million was bought with IOUs. The sterling balances were soaked in blood. But when the war ended, the British government looked at the debt and decided they did not want to pay it. Or rather, they could not pay it without damaging their own standard of living. John Maynard Keynes, often celebrated as a liberal genius, played a dark role here. He advised the British government on how to handle the Indian debt. He privately expressed contempt for Indian claims. He suggested the debt should be cancelled or written down. He argued India should have contributed to the war anyway. In the end, Britain did not default openly. That would have destroyed the credibility of the pound globally. Instead, they did something more insidious. They blocked the balances. When India became independent in 1947, the new government asked for their money. The British said no. You cannot have it all at once. We will release it in tiny drops over many years. They froze the assets. Then came the second trick, devaluation. In 1949, Britain devalued the pound against the dollar. Because the Indian rupee was pegged to the pound, the value of India's savings crashed overnight. By delaying repayment and then devaluing the currency, Britain effectively wiped out a massive percentage of the debt. They paid India back with money worth a fraction of what it had been when the goods were taken. It was the final grand larceny of the empire. This financial maneuvering had devastating consequences for newly independent India. India started life as a free nation with a massive handicap. The capital that should have been available for development was locked up in London, losing value every day. India faced a severe dollar shortage. They could not import the technology they needed from America because their wealth was trapped in British pounds. This forced India into a closed economy. It forced restrictive economic policies just to survive. The poverty of post-independence India was not just bad local policy. It was capital starvation engineered by London. The legacy of this silver and gold manipulation is still visible today. The $45 trillion figure is not just a number on a page. It represents the lost potential of a civilization. If that wealth had remained in India and been invested at normal rates of compound interest, India would likely be a first-world nation today. Britain's Industrial Revolution was financed by Indian silver. Railways weren't gifts, they were extraction tools, funded by Indian taxes, overpriced for British industry and designed to move wealth out, not people within. The silver trick was the master key. By keeping India on a weakening silver standard while Britain held gold, the terms of trade were permanently rigged. It was a casino where the house set the odds and changed the chips. What we call developed and developing was not destiny, it was transfer. Western wealth grew by draining the East through legal systems, paper signatures, and accounting, not armies. When the British left India in 1947, they did not leave behind a healthy nation. They left a country with just 12% literacy, a life expectancy of 32 years, and virtually no per capita income growth after 2 centuries of rule. India, once a global manufacturing powerhouse, had been reduced to a supplier of raw materials. As the Union Jack came down and the tricolor rose, the vaults of the Bank of England remained full-filled with wealth extracted from Indian labor, trade, and currency manipulation. The story of the silver rupee and the gold pound exposes how the modern world was built. It challenges the myth of Western superiority and reveals that markets were never truly free. They were enforced by empire. The most powerful weapon was not the gun, but the currency. Tens of trillions in wealth were drained, never to be repaid. Understanding how it was taken is the first step toward reclaiming the history stolen with it. Sovereignty is solvency. Control the money, and you control the nation. Britain did not conquer India with better soldiers, but with better accounting and banking. The damage was generational and structural. Even today, India's economic instincts, gold, caution, survival reflect that trauma. This is not ancient history. It is a blueprint. The methods evolve, but the logic remains. Control currency, debt, and interest, and you control the future.